Okay. Good evening. I have been asked by the selectmen to put together a presentation covering what I'm going to call the West Harwich groundwater plume. There have been some questions circulating about what is the plume, what is the extent of the plume, when did it start, why aren't we doing more about solving sampling issues, etc. So I've put together some information. I just want to start by saying I have reviewed over 1,000 pages of documents, and in the time that we have tonight, I am going to take a lot of liberties in condensing the material as much as possible so that I know that we don't want to be here listening to my wonderful depth and breadth of knowledge until 3 a.m. So I am going to make a lot of generalizations. I'm going to make some assumptions. I am going to try to digest and consolidate numbers rather than going into very specific numbers on sampling. I'm going to speak in some broad generalizations. And then if there is follow-up, I will be very glad to reference documents, make studies available. But I have an agenda, a quick outline of what I hope to cover here tonight. I'm going to go over a synopsis of the West Harwich plume. It is a tale of approximately 20 years old now, and numerous sites are involved. The study area is actually approximately 1 square mile, emanating from the Dennisport side all the way over, going northeast to the Herring River. And there are a number of different sites involved, and I will try to put these in chronological order, try to put some context to it, lessons learned, recommendations. I hope to cover some risk communication, which is, I think, where the public's interest is, in what does this mean to the homes in the area, the drinking water, airborne pollution, crops, people gardening, and the Herring River itself. And I'm going to go over the status of past reports, some recommendations, and follow-through. I have a map here that I will be referring to several times during the presentation, and it's a compilation of quite a bit of information. We have the Herring River over here on the right-hand side. The dots on here represent different things. The red triangles are indoor air sample locations. I don't know if it comes out pretty well on the screen. The areas in pink are some of our study areas. This is also a compilation of numerous groundwater wells, air sampling indoors, drinking water wells, irrigation wells. So I'll highlight a few of these different things as I go through. And I want to thank the GIS person in the water department for putting this map together. We didn't have anything like this electronically, so they assisted us with putting together a lot of the paperwork into this very useful map. The studies that I'm going to go are documented. They're documented with the DEP, and we'll be referring to them in this different context. The Pinewood Village condominiums, which is a known release and tracking, a site investigation report of the Harwich PCE-TCE, which was a DEP contracted, Department of Environmental Protection contracted study, the Dennisport automatic coin laundry, which is a release report, and an environmental site assessment, which was commissioned by the town of Harwich over for 5 Bellsneck Road. And these studies take place between 1997 and 2011. We're going to be talking about a couple of chemical compounds. The one we refer to frequently is tetrachloroethylene. So its common name, which I will be using, is PCE. It is a solvent. It is an excellent solvent. It has been used widely in the dry cleaning industry, the automobile industry. It is a very effective solvent. It is volatile. It is non-flammable. It is pretty stable in a liquid form. The non-flammable part of it is why it's been so widely used as a degreaser and a solvent in industry. This is the chemical compound. It is 2 2 carbon atoms with 4 chlorine atoms surrounding it. The key thing to remember is its volatility. While it is a liquid, it off-gases very readily at room temperature. The other compound that we'll be talking about is trichloroethylene, and this is also another common degreaser used more in the automobile industry than the dry cleaning industry. And this, again, this is also a double carbon compound. This has 3 atoms of chlorine and 1 atom of hydrogen. It's similar in its physical and chemical properties, but used in different industries. We're going to start with Pinewood Village condominiums. It is a cottage colony over on Bells Neck Road. It is just directly north of the West Harwich School and the Baptist Church and Cemetery on the corner of 28 and Bells Neck Road. The Pinewood Village condominium complex is a complex of 16 cottages. It was a cottage colony in the famous days of everybody coming to the Cape and renting a cute little cottage. As those went out of favor in 1978, the owner of the cottage colony came to the town, to the Board of Appeals, and filed to obtain condominium status, received that, sold off the cottages individually. A fatal mistake at the time was that the town water department, the property was on town water. In order to condominiumize, the regulations of the water department wanted more individual meters involved at all of the cottages. The owner of the property objected to the cost and having to put in those meters and chose to sink a private well. So the cottage colony was then served by a private well. In the mid-1980s, the State Department of Environmental Protection classified a lot of these small drinking water supplies as community water supplies subject to testing. This condominium then had to hire their own treatment operator. They had to do water analyses. It took them a few years to get into the fold. It wasn't until the DEP issued them an order to comply that the testing was finally done. And in 1997, in August of 1997, the first round of chemical testing came back, and it was learned that it was the outside of the parameters. It had very high content of tetrachloroethylene, the PCE, vinyl chlorides, dichlorobenzene, vinyl chloride, trichloroethylene, dichloroethylene, and tetrachloroethylene. The PCE levels were at 260, where the drinking water standard was 5. So we were 25 times higher than what the standard allowed. With numbers such as this, DEP immediately issued a do not use order. They provided bottled water. It was an immediate action plan where fortunately, it was at the end of August, and most of the cottages were seasonal. Bottled water was brought in. They were issued a cease and desist order. Consequently, the Board of Health issued a condemnation, and the 16 cottages were ordered vacated and kept that way until a suitable water supply was brought in. They worked over the course of the winter to bring in town water. 2 residents ended up being relocated because of the water supply, and we assisted them in finding new residences. This is a site plan. The condominium was ordered to hire an engineer to find out what was the problem, what was contributing to the problem of the PCE in the water supply. When they did the study, they found some anecdotal information of some other gasoline stations, dry cleaners in the area, and so they were looking. They sunk wells, they did groundwater monitoring. They sunk 4 wells on this site. Their own drinking water well was approximately in this little panhandle location, and they sunk up gradient, down gradient wells and tested those. They were not able to find the source. The level of the contamination was not just in the upper level of the water supply. It was deep below the surface. So it was determined that there was no source found on site, that it had to come from an upgradient source, and then something called a downgradient property status was filed. This is a terminology that DEP uses, that if you are ordered to correct something on your site, if contamination is found, but then it's discovered that it's something that has traveled onto your site, you're not required to clean that up. You're a victim of something else. And this is called a downgradient property status. So the Pinewood Village condominium filed that downgradient property status, and their case, this is consolidating a couple of years, that was closed. So during the time of the Pinewood Village, which is this situation here, there were other residents, particularly north and east of the situation, that had some private water supplies and became interested in having their wells tested. There was quite a bit in the newspaper. People were concerned that since the water supply was so high at Pinewood Village, so the town health department took on the project to put out bulletins. If anyone in the area wanted their water tested, we would arrange to have it done. It was, you know, we thought that we were doing a good public service. So we had sites, as I say, along the river, north. We even had sites on the other side of the river and down south along Riverside Drive. So we had a number of samples taken. Much to our surprise, the area of North and Smith Street made the Pinewood Village condominium pale in comparison. It's a situation I will never forget. I was attending a conference off Cape when the office called to let me know what the laboratory reports were for the North and Smith Street homes. They were 5,000 parts per billion, 1,000 times higher than the standard. And in comparison to Pinewood Village, which was down in the hundreds, it was shocking. I packed my bags, immediately came home to the office and told my office to have the water superintendent meet me in my office at 6 o'clock. And at 8 o'clock that night, we were what I always refer to as trick-or-treating on North Street. I was knocking on the doors to tell people to not have another glass of water. I was so concerned about that situation. So we had an immediate notification to the neighborhood. Within a couple of days, we had an emergency installation of town water along North Road. We laid temporary lines over the ground so that there would be no more use of water in that situation. Wells to the east and the south were acceptable. We took some grab samples out of the Herring River, and those were negative. This defied what we thought was the common logic of what we were expecting in the area. If you have had the opportunity to study the piles of groundwater information on Cape Cod, we always talk about the Mid-Cape area being kind of like the groundwater divide all the way across the Cape, where anything north of the Mid-Cape area flows to the bay, south of the Mid-Cape area flows into Nantucket Sound. So how are we getting opportunities and well sampling 1,000 times the standard? We couldn't find a source immediately in the area. As we brought in some more experts, we were learning that the Herring River was such a major hydrogeographic area that it was actually pulling the water from the northeast direction. Instead of the water all flowing from north to south into Nantucket Sound, the pull of the Herring River is so strong, has such a dynamic power that it is actually pulls the groundwater all the way over from the Dennisport side of the line up into a northeast direction a mile away. And so now we knew that we were having problems from another area, and not just localized at Pinewood Village and what was happening on the Herring River. But anyway, our immediate concerns were taking care of the drinking water supply, which we did. We continued to canvass neighborhoods and test irrigation wells, and we felt that we had the immediate problem pretty well under control. Another year or so later, the DEP contacted me. They had grant money, and they wanted to study the area of the West Harwich plume. The numbers were very significant. We know that we have a very porous soil, and the numbers in the groundwater plume were so significant and the groundwater so close to the surface, they wanted to do some indoor air quality sampling to see if there was vaporization of the volatile chemicals into confined spaces. So the DEP independently sunk money into hiring a consultant, a number of monitoring wells, 23 groundwater locations with groundwater monitoring at 10-foot intervals. Indoor air quality at 15 homes in the Harwich Library were all studied over the course of a couple of years. This has now become a very well-defined plume. We have hundreds of water samples that have been taken in a 15-year period, and a significant number of air samples performed over time. The study locations for the indoor air were chosen based upon their proximity to the highest concentrations of the TCE and PCE. They were chosen as to whether or not they had sand basements. They were looking for volatilization up through the soil. And so throughout the study, there were, it was surprisingly lower than one would expect. That is a very good thing. When we knew that we had a plume of contamination coming through at 5,000 parts per billion, the highest level that we had in the groundwater was only 49 parts per billion. That was at one sampling, and subsequent sampling over 4 times lowered that to below detectable limits. The analysis of that highest number, 49, it was not determined whether or not that was actually coming from vaporization, volatilization with the plume, or whether it was also contributing from indoor chemical compounds within the house, such as paints, wood strippers, solvents. So it was never determined as to which contributing source that was. In addition, the DEP site investigation report started to link the contributing activities from Dennis to the West Harwich plume. The vertical profiling indicated that the highest levels were 50 or 60 feet below grade on Belmont Road. That was in 2001. The lateral extent of the plume was very well defined, and the system was moving northeast to the Herring River. A couple of other very comforting thing health-wise was that in profiling the plume, it was learned that there's a layer of fresh groundwater which confines the plume. Getting back to the chemistry of TCE and PCE, PCE, tetrachloroethylene, is heavier than water. So the chemical properties are that when it is dispersed into the plume, it will sink rather than floating along the groundwater lens. So when we looked at, how come we had numbers of 5,000, nothing, hundreds, nothing, all over the place? After the scientists looked at the hundreds of groundwater samples that were taken, they were able to actually do a vertical and a horizontal profile of that plume and be able to study the physical and chemical characteristics of the tetrachloroethylene as it travels through the soil and the water supply, and be able to track over time. They were also able to map the movement of the groundwater in that area and determined that a drop of water coming out of the Dennisport West Harwich line moves at approximately a half a foot a day. So from that point of release, it will take approximately 20 years for it to reach the Herring River. So a lot of study, a lot of information in this area. I talked about this. The indoor air sample results were 49 per cubic meter of PCE. I've seen differences on limits as 11. There is a time-weighted average for an OSHA standard of 100 in basement levels. There were no levels detected on the first floor. The results decreased over 2 years, and many of them were below detectable limits. due to the changing characteristics of the plume over time, there is a recommendation at the time that additional water and air sampling should be considered, especially at 6165 and 93 North Road. Those are the three homes right on the Herring River. This now brings us to the Dennisport Automatic Coin Laundry. This is a laundromat with dry cleaning facilities just over the line in Dennisport on the corner of Hall Street and 28. It was established in 1959, and from 1964 to 1997 it operated a dry cleaning establishment. The method of disposal was through lagoons, cesspools, discharge on the ground. It is estimated that the TCE and the PCE, tetrachloroethylene, was discharged as part of a cleaning operation and recapturing the tetrachloroethylene through the dry cleaning equipment. There are reports of the DEP that the PCE was first discovered at an adjacent property in 1994, but it wasn't until 1997 that the DEP actually issued a cease and desist to the Dennisport Automatic Coin Laundry. There's volumes of information on the DEP website of all of the engineering studies, the ongoing annual testing, the immediate response plans, the remediation, all on the Dennisport Laundry, and I will go over how to access some of that information. This is where the Dennisport Laundry is. This is the Dennis West Harwich property line. The levels of TCE when the cease and desist order was issued, there was a shallow well on the site, and it was measured at 17,000 parts per billion of PCE. A second well, a deeper well, the next year was measured at 33,000 parts per billion of tetrachloroethylene. So I think that we could make an assumption as to what the major source of the PCE is in the West Harwich plume. Covered all of that. There's been, again, extensive profiling. There are groundwater solute transport systems. There's been remedial action plans to allow the dispersal / attenuation of the chemical compounds. And this is supported by the laundromat's engineers, volumes of monitoring results showing lowered contaminant levels over time. There are reports about remediation. The choice is to allow this to attenuate over time. Given the massive amount of travel of the plume, it's a mile to the northeast, and because of its physical characteristics, we do not have a dense aqueous liquid phase. Many of us are familiar with reading about gasoline stations when there is a release of gas. The physical properties of gasoline are that it is lighter than water, and it will float on top of the water. It does not mix very readily, and you actually have a dense liquid phase that you can then sink recapture wells, and that's a method of remediation with a lot of petroleum products. With this type of a product, where it sinks below the water, it disperses a little bit more, and again, it has traveled so far over time, it moves with the groundwater. There's not a confined area to put in recapture wells and to seek remediation. And so the platform by the laundromat's consultants to the DEP was that this was too difficult, too enormous a cost to try and recapture something that had been going on for such a long period of time. In addition, since they had a cease and desist order and stopped putting those chemicals into the water, that over a period of time, the soil would attenuate it, there would be some breakdown, and sooner or later it would reach the Herring River. Agree, right, wrong, whatever, that is the path that has been chosen, which is what is the ongoing plan of attack for the Dennisport automatic coin laundry. And again, this support shows that there's a clean lens overlying the plume, which is eliminating the exposure risks. When you're looking at a plume, what are the sources of contamination? We have groundwater risks, we have indoor air quality risks. The engineers and the consultants are demonstrating that a lot of these risks have been minimized. This is a vertical profile of 1997 to 2000. It's very interesting to sum up some of the things that I've just been saying. The top line, that is the topography. This is the Dennisport coin laundromat, and this flows topographically all the way over to the Herring River. So that's ground level. You're looking at a vertical profile. The colors in here is what has been determined to be the extent of the plume and how it is traveling through the groundwater. So if you see that the blue area, this is the clean liquid lens that I was talking about that more or less keeps the plume in check through most of its travel until it surfaces over here and discharges at the Herring River. So when we talk about exposure risks, this is the type of science that's behind the recommendations and the acceptance of the plans and the studies with the DEP. So the colors here represent the different amounts. The yellow has been mapped at 0 to 500, 500 to 1,000, all the way into the center of 4,000 and 5,000 parts per billion. So that's the vertical profile. This is looking at it with a little more color differentiation, but that's what they're talking about. What does attenuation mean? The lighter colors. Either it's dispersing, a little bit might be absorbed into the soil, some of it is broken down under certain conditions. The tetrachloroethylene, in the presence of anaerobic bacteria, there is some reduction, dechlorination. The anaerobic bacteria will break down some of the spin-offs, some of the chlorine atoms off of that compound, and it will break down into other, they usually call them daughter products. So when it's attenuated, has it just suddenly disappeared? No, it's dispersed more, it's broken down into other compounds. Some of the other compounds are just as nasty as the original compound. One of the daughter compounds, the end-up breakdown compounds of tetrachloroethylene is vinyl chloride, which is a known carcinogen. But when we hear the word attenuation, what does that mean? The next point on the studies is the West Harwich School. As you know from the map, this immediately abuts the Pinewood Village condominium and was the subject of discussion a few years ago when there was some talk of converting the building to housing. In 2010, a consultant was hired by the town to review the case history and address public concerns over the reuse of the building and what exposure risks there were from groundwater contamination. Additional wells were sunk on the site, and the result was below reportable limits for the volatile organic compounds. Again, if we look at that profile, that vertical profile, if you sink a shallow well, you're in that clean groundwater lens above the plume. One of the outcomes was that, well, consider some additional sampling. If you actually are going to use this building, either in its present state or in remodel, you might want to have some additional water samples. You might want to consider some ambient air testing as a potential landlord or as a potential seller of the building. It would be prudent information to have. Another suggestion was to consider filing for downgradient property status because there's so much information that we know we didn't cause the problem. However, under the 21E Massachusetts contingency plan laws, if it's on your property, you own it. So one way to release yourself from liability is to go on record that, hey, I know it's there, but I didn't cause it, and it's on record. So that is something to consider doing. We had some mixed messages. The consultant at the time said that they had talked with the DEP and they felt that there was enough information to substantiate that and we didn't need to do it. Another report that came to the town in 2012 said, hey, you should consider doing it. So that should be something up for discussion. The next item was in 2012, following the West Harwich school reports to the town administrator contacted the DEP and asked for guidance as to what was our potential risk, what were our liabilities, what should we be doing next as a town if we're considering not only the entire West Harwich area, but our own issue. And this is important. I don't like to read slides, but I want to read this because it sums up a lot of what I'm talking about. From the DEP, the releases of chlorinated solvents and petroleum at the laundry site could only pose a risk to human health if people were exposed to the contamination. The potential exposure routes for volatile organic compounds released to the groundwater are through drinking water or through the impact to indoor air of occupied buildings. Drinking water or occupied buildings. Given the nature of these specific compounds, those are the routes of exposure that we need to be talking about and addressing. And in the 15 years that these studies have been going on, as we've identified some problems, we've acted pretty quickly to take care of them. We've assisted immediately with drinking water supplies. We've assisted with the DEP. The DEP has put a lot of money into studying this area. The 2012 request for regulatory guidance again said drinking water wells. Private wells in the area were replaced with town water. Check. Irrigation wells. The question has come up, well, what about the irrigation wells? We did test a few of them. We did find some low numbers of the TCEs at the time. The DEP guidance is that this volatilizes. When the PCE undergoes aeration, it volatilizes, and the risk from irrigation wells is minimal. Do we continue to have concern about irrigation wells? As a public health officer, I do, because I can't always protect everybody from how they're going to use that well. Whether the house sells, whether they use it to wash the dog, whether they fill up the swimming pools. Do they really know that it's only to be connected to the irrigation system and don't ever stop and have a drink out of that? I can't protect everyone in 100% of the situation. So, you know, I tend to err on the side of science, and I'm not always wild about the continued use of the irrigation wells because of the not protecting every situation. The groundwater. The plume is suppressed by the clean water lens. So there's not a risk to your plants growing. There's not a risk to your garden. If you are disturbing the groundwater at the very top of the lens, it's going to be the clean lens. You have to go down 30, 40, 50 feet in most of the areas of West Harwich before you get into that contaminated plume. Indoor air, there have been multiple samples, and that at that time it was determined that there was no impact. Again, is there zero risk? There's never zero risk. We have to think about, again, this is 15, going on 20 years later. Maybe we need to look at some education. Maybe we need to remind people, and that if they're doing alterations, they might want to do some air testing, just to rule that out, and so that if they're planning an alteration, they can do some simple remediation. What do you do in this kind of situation? A lot of it would be similar to radon, where you just need air exchange. You might want to put in a passive ventilation system. Some of the recommendations, my recommendations from going through all of the literature, that the town should look at perhaps filing for the down gradient property status for 5 Belsnick Road. Take up that issue again, get it on the books. Consider if and when the property is ever considered to be put back into occupancy at 5 Belsnick Road, answer those questions, as any good landlord would, run an air test just to be able to answer the questions. Some sort of an education or awareness campaign for the properties within the Plume area. As I say, there's turnover in owners. Obviously, there are people that had not heard about this. The issue is coming up again. An awareness or a cautionary education for Herring River properties. If they're concerned, it's private responsibility. It's not a town responsibility if they want to consider air sampling. We can't guarantee that there are not going to continue to be large slugs of the concentrated high numbers until that gets all the way through. We're pretty confident that at the time the indoor air quality testing was done in 1999 and 2001, we knew the corresponding groundwater below those properties right on the river was 5,000. Yet we were getting barely detectable limits within those homes. That was a very good correlation on homes that didn't have any basements that are on soil. So and the groundwater being 8 to 10 feet below the level of the homes. Cautionary use of irrigation wells for the reasons that I stated before. And if anyone's interested, here's where I got all my facts. 1,000 or so pages. I'm happy to provide detail. I'm happy to discuss a lot of the numbers in more depth, but again, broad generalization for you tonight.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
Chris, you had something to add to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I had reached out to DEP and I did get a response back. I'm not gonna, I think what Paula covered is basically the same information that they had given to me, that it is safe because the plume is so far down. And then he did specifically address the site, and just based upon DEP's review of the site file at the dry cleaner, on the data described above, it appears unlikely that the redevelopment / construction work at 5 Belsnick Road would cause an exposure pathway for the VOCs associated with the Dennisport automatic coin laundry site. And then the similar thing, he says, however, it may be prudent for the town to sample existing groundwater wells in the area of 5 Belsnick Road to verify current contaminant concentrations in groundwater. So he goes in, he's a little bit more detailed, but basically he's reiterated what Paula said. And in terms of this, I had asked for DEP. I said, do you want to come out and participate? And the gentleman, LAN Pino, you probably know who he is, said that he would just review the file and send a letter. So I just wanted to, obviously we'll put this on the site so people are aware of it, but I don't think it's anything different than what was presented.
Chris, can you forward that email to the board, please?
Yep.
Thank you. Questions from the board? Janelle?
No, thank you. That was very informative.
Thank
Julie?
you.
No, it was very good. Thank you.
Angelo?
Just a question. I thought, well, this was discussed a number of years ago, that the feeling was eventually that whole plume would disappear into the Herring River and be gone. And every day that goes by, there's more movement and out.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still what is thought? In other words,
Yes, the literature demonstrated that the groundwater in that area moved a half a foot a day. And so theoretically, from the laundromat to the Herring River, a drop would take 20 years to reach the Herring River. So eventually, over time, that, supposedly, we should be nearing the end of that travel over through West Harwich.
I think that the chemicals that we're talking about at the laundromat stopped being utilized in 1997.
Correct,
Is that?
correct.
It's close to 20 years.
It's close to 20 years, yes.
Thank
And
you.
then it goes out Herring River.
Comments
And
from the
it-
public?
One day.
Sharon?
Sharon Flieger, just a resident of Harwich. I have a question. When you said there was a protection because of the groundwater, what happens in states of droughts, when there's droughts? And we are in one now. I was just wondering if the groundwater level drops, does that cause an issue?
The whole groundwater lens will drop. And so it will be further from the ground surface.
All right, so you're saying that the chemicals are going to go even further down?
Correct.
Okay, all right.
Duncan, you were up next.
First of all, let me thank you. That was a spectacular presentation, brilliant for all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Speaking as somebody who's living like right over it, basically. Two additional points, one of which I was kind of surprised because there was a operating dry cleaner right now where the Rite Aid is from like the late 40s to the late 60s. I remember that. So there's like an overlap period here. So I'm wondering if that's part of where the density of that drop could be in a completely unregulated kind of environment before the coin-op went into place. So that's one kind of historical question. Then the second thing is, if we're looking at a 0.6 of a mile, like over a half a mile transit area, you're saying it goes, that's 5,200 feet, is that correct, approximately for a mile? And it's going 6 inches a year?
Okay.
Excuse me, 6 inches a day? Okay, so so we're moving, okay, so that's great, all right. Just checking, thank you, I really appreciate the work, thank you.
You, Duncan. Lou?
Mr. Chair, through you, I have a question for Paula. Paula, great presentation.
Thank you.
One quick question. All these chemicals, and I can't use your chemical terminology, but all these chemicals flow into the Herring River. Is that correct, basically?
Yes. The
And-
groundwater discharges to the Herring River.
Right. At what depth at the Herring River do the chemicals flow in?
The fresh water flows under the salt water. The groundwater rises at the bottom of the river.
So the chemicals, I'll use common lay language. The chemicals are flowing from Dennis at about 50 feet. They continue at about 50 feet under the river and then are pulled up.
We're getting into hydrogeology that I don't totally understand. The fresh water discharges into the Herring River. Now, some of it, you can see at a tidal line, you can see rivulets of fresh water when the tide goes out. It's similar to that in the Herring River. It will also come up at the bottom of the river.
How
But
deep is the river?
I don't know. I think it's pretty deep in the middle. I'm not familiar with that.
I'm not being smart, I'm just
I-
asking a question.
I don't know.
I don't think it's 50 feet. That's why I'm asking the question. I think my interest would be in those homes that are right next to the river on North Road, that are right there at the river, which might have the plume, and I'm just using common sense, rise because the water is, the river's pulling it, the fresh water, and in pulling the fresh water up, then that's the lens, then it might also pull the chemicals up at the same time. So that might change. There's a question there that I think the people that live there would have an interest in getting answered. So that's the only question, and you may not have an answer.
So what's the actual question? Because you lost.
Should we do a study on the North Road properties to see if the chemicals are flowing up closer to those homes, the water table and everything else?
believe we've answered that. I believe the test wells were along those North Road homes, and the river was actually tested as well.
Correct. Yes.
Go ahead, Paula.
And so those homes have nothing to worry about.
Those homes have had indoor air testing. Those, the 61, 63, and 65, those three houses closest to Smith Street were the ones that have been studied the most, because that's where the groundwater, their well was 5,000. That's right at the point of discharge on the river. Their homes, one of them was the highest number that we got throughout the several years. The first number was 49 and subsequently went down below detectable limits. There were samples taken right near that location of the Herring River, and there was nothing detected. The flow of the Herring River there is so great that the scientists believe that anything entering there is also going to be subject to aeration and volatilize. I have tried to look, I know this question has come up, well, what about the river, what about fish? I've tried to do a literature search. I did see some information about these chlorinated solvents in freshwater ponds, but then you have to remember that that's more of a closed system, and some of the impact on fish, etc. This is a very swift-moving river, and again, what the scientists were telling us at the time was that this was subject to a lot of aeration. When the air quality testing was done, there was also outdoor. You always do that. When you do indoor air quality testing, what the heck does the number mean if you don't know what the outdoor number is? So there was study done of any background number as well as indoor number. So if someone's thinking that hypothesizing that the chemical is being pulled out of the water and might be impacting the homes, it wasn't showing anything outdoors in that immediate area.
Thank you, Paula. Lou, does that answer your question?
I think so.
Thank you. Sally?
Thank you, Paula. A couple questions. From what I understand, this is all through the EPA, a temporary fix that they're prescribed for the Dennisport laundry using natural attenuation. And it continues to be that way, and that a permanent fix is not going to happen based on either it costs too much money, they couldn't get it done quickly enough, or they don't have the means by which to fix it. Okay, so I'm kind of concerned about that. And then the next thing kind of points to Duncan's point that, from what I read, yes, a lot of this comes from the Dennisport coin-operated laundry, but there was one there where the CVS is. So there were two in Dennisport. Over in West Harwich, we had one on 16 Main Street, 72 Main Street. There was also an auto parts store. I can't find that address. And there was also a heating home fuel spill on 97 in West Harwich. I just feel like that's a lot of spills going on there, and it's been a bit of time since this has been looked at. I'm wondering why we can't look at this again and have it evaluated a little bit as to. I've heard through the Department of Environmental Protection that there still are pockets of concern on Silver Street and is it Depot? Sorry, I don't remember at the moment. Depot? Did I say Depot? So I'm a little concerned still.
When we started this study with the Pinewood Village, there was anecdotal information brought to the office through other municipal agencies of other possible sources in the area. Some of them were substantiated and some of them weren't. There were talk of other laundromat. Someone called to say they had worked there when they were a child and they were in their 80s and they remember the lagoons. Either some of them were discharged for just laundromats and not dry cleaning, so they were ruled out because they weren't using the same kind of chemicals. And a couple of others were just anecdotal and couldn't be substantiated. There is one point in the literature, and Mrs. Urbano, I know that you've read a lot of the literature and may have seen that in one portion in the literature. One of the reasons why it appears that the laundromat, the Dennisport laundromat, isn't listed as being solely responsible is because of this question in the literature that there may be some other minor contributors. There was also one set of test wells in the West Harwich area that indicated there could have been another minor contributing factor because of the gradation in the plume where the PCE and TCE was found. We're getting into a lot of minutia here. But the point being, there alludes to some other sites in the documents, and so that's also why Dennisport Laundry hasn't been solely responsible, and they in their studies they continue to use that bit of information. And yes, what you say, attenuation, it's too expensive, it's too broad, let's just let it go. We've taken care of the risk exposures. Seems to be the accepted, good, bad, or indifferent, right or wrong. That is what is being accepted as the remediation. How can we get the light to shine on these other places again and do more studies? All of this is being driven by the DEP and the Massachusetts contingency plan. The town of Harwich can't just go to knock on someone's door and say, I heard you were a laundromat in 1950s and I think you contributed to this. I'd like you to do some studies. The whole process is driven by the DEP regulation. If someone, if there is contamination found on your property and the monitoring wells show that there's a problem, you're required to report it to the DEP. They issue you a notice of responsibility. You have to come up with a response plan, testing, consultants, et cetera. Then the players and the DEP work out what's the cleanup plan, or it was caused by someone else. They continue to monitor it over time, and again, they have to look at the cost, benefit, health risks. We may not like the answers. I don't think a person in this room will disagree with me if I say it's a travesty what happened to that groundwater and that those discharges were allowed to continue until 1997. That's a travesty. But you have to evaluate what is the health risk. I think that that's been done. If there are private wells out there that we don't know about, we certainly want to counsel those residents. We want to meet with those residents and take care of any lingering issues.
Thank you, Paula.
Nancy Pollard again. I live on one of those houses on the Herring River, which we purchased in 2000. First of all, are you only talking about well water? If you have town water, do you even need to be concerned?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
you do not need to be concerned if you have town water.
Thank you.
The town water is highly regulated, monitored, tested, and it is from other parts of town. The well water supply is from other parts of town. It's not anywhere close to this
Right.
West Harwich plume.
I also spent many weeks and years, summers, in Pinewood Village as a child. Now, you're saying back then we had town water before it became condominiums, when it was cottages?
That's my understanding, that it had been on town water, and when it was condominiumized in 1978 is when they drilled the well.
Okay, because I grew up there summers as a child. My children grew up there summers when they were children. But obviously it was previous to the condominium overtake. Am I correct?
Again,
I know my
don't
children are
know-
concerned.
I don't know when town water was first available in that part of town, but my understanding was that in the 70s, it was on town water, and then made the decision to put in their own private well when they went to a condominium.
We could certainly get you the dates on what town
I'd ap-
water was in there.
I'd appreciate that.
Right. Can you give your name and phone
Nancy.
number to
Oh,
administration?
okay.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else on that topic? Okay, the second part of this is the proposal from Bennett and O'Reilly to do a site test on the schoolhouse property. Any comments from the board on that proposal that's in the packet? Chris, do you want to outline the proposal that's in the packet?
Well, I think as Paula had alluded to, that to kind of close the loop, if the board wants to close the loop on 5 Bell's Neck, that it makes some sense to have Bennett come in and do that work. It's about $6,000. Just, after kind of thinking about it and looking at it, I mean, I think the board needs to make a decision kind of first and foremost, and even the recommendation, that if we're going to redevelop the site, you'd want to make sure the site was clean before any redevelopment. So just basically confirm what we believe already, that I think it was 2010 that it came back as a clean location. So I think it would be prudent to do that. If the board isn't going to redevelop it anytime soon, then why do the testing until you're going to plan on redeveloping it? So I think the question for the board, and I think I brought this up a couple weeks ago in terms of what's the thought process? I mean, it's been a vacant building for a long time, an extended period, and if it's going to remain a vacant building, do we need to test until we do something with it?
Thank you, Chris.
So I think that's the prudent.
Yeah, and I brought it up because it was on the agenda. I don't think that the board, it's not on the agenda to decide what we're going to do with the building, so I'm not sure the board needs to take an action on that tonight. Angelo?
Well, let me just ask you a different question. We have data on that particular building from 10 and 20 years ago, roughly. Would it be helpful to everybody in the area for us to do the school again and compare it to the data we have? And hopefully what will happen is that the number will be way, way down, which may mean that gets generalized to the rest of the area. Is what I'm saying correct? I mean, if it was 50 parts and then 25, now it's 3, can we have the generation, the idea that the rest of the area is probably cleaning up also?
It would be just that immediate area.
Just
I mean,
immediate area.
again, looking at the profile of the plume that I showed before, this whole thing may be moving as a vertical slug. So it depends on where it is in the transport to the Herring River. Where you tested before was up in the blue part. That was under the West Harwich School, is that they were shallow wells, and that plume was being held down by the freshwater lens.
Thank you. Julie?
Just out of curiosity, has Dennis studied any of this? Have they done any testing?
Not outside of what was required. This is all private. The town does not come in and do the testing and coordinate cleanup sites. It's done by the property owner, DEP, and their consultant. Again, we're actually very fortunate that the DEP took an interest in what was happening in this area and sunk a lot of money. Just, if you look at the proposal from Bennett and O'Reilly to do two sets of residential testing, it's $1,000. There were hundreds of tests done over as part of that DEP study with 23 wells, 15 homes, hundreds of water samples. So that was a laboratory. They were using this as a research laboratory to find out the relationship between the solute transport, doing a good vertical horizontal profile of that groundwater plume and how it related to volatilization of chemicals through very porous soils 10 feet from a home, underneath a home. What was the risk? And they found very, very low, minimal.
My only thought was if they did any testing in Denison and it is moving in that capacity, then we might have a better way to compare, because if it's moving, then it might be gone out of Denison.
Excuse me, the laundromat continues to test, and their numbers are becoming quite low to the point where they're appealing to DEP to lower their testing requirements.
Yeah,
Saying,
just,
we're done, we're
in-
done.
In
we're
my
over."
conversation with the gentleman at DEP, and I don't know if he put it necessarily in here, but he said that the test sites that they have looked at, everywhere else has come back clean. The only site that is still an issue is right at the laundromat itself.
Oh, really?
So
Okay.
they have not cleaned that yet to the degree
the-
where it's released.
Thank you. So unless somebody on,
I just wanted to ask that there were 3 residences that the DEP suggested be retested later, and I don't think that was ever done. And what should our line of action be now?
That was a recommendation to the private residences. That was not
So the private resident is then responsible to do the follow-up?
yes, if there is ongoing concern,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
thank you. So unless someone on the board wants to make a motion on that proposal, I say we bring it back when we discuss the West Harwich School.
Michael, you have another gentleman.
Oh.
My name is Danny Horn, 34 Smith Street, just north and east of the schoolhouse. I just wonder, maybe, it seems like the risk, if there is any risk, is in air quality in basements. And how much does that cost? Any idea? And how do you go about getting that tested?
I would be happy to share the testing that was done in that area to see if your home is one of the ones that was tested. If you're aware of that?
I guess, can I just clarify? It seems like you're talking about testing, expensive testing at the schoolhouse property, and you're testing, and that's to do with the water samples, the surface water, or?
Water and air.
And air.
Water and air.
Both of them. So, yeah, it seems like it's all going down, and even back then it was very minimal. So, I don't know, I just wonder if it seemed like the air quality was the issue with the schoolhouse, and by extenuation, by extension, other properties. That's why I'm asking the question, I guess.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
the air quality at the West Harwich School, I believe the issue was raised because of knowledge of this plume in the West Harwich area. The testing that was done at the 15 locations for indoor air quality did not demonstrate a problem
So there, no problem.
at that time.
Okay,
yes.
thanks.
Thank you. So with that, if anyone wants to make a motion, otherwise, let's move on. Great, thank you. Thank you, Paula. Thank you very much. And Chris. Next up on the agenda is a request by George Olmsted for support for a petition article in Chatham to change the name of Muddy Creek to Monomoy River. Is Mr. Olmsted here?